There's still just a handful of you that haven't found a home in a PLF session, so take care of that. There have already been a week of those, so take care of those sooner than later. And if there's some reason, those of you that haven't gotten into one, if there's some reason why you can't do any of them, come and see me and we'll figure out what to do. I'm also still filling up any spots that become available. I know there might be a few people still in here trying to get in. Something came open over the weekend, and it's all filled it up again, and I'm going to keep on that, but we're running out of time. I think we got to do something this week. So keep in touch, and cross your fingers. Okay. Any questions? Any questions on stuff we did last time you want to get squared away before we move on to new things? In good shape? Does anybody remember what we did last time? Okay, when we quit, we actually spent a little over a day talking about a situation that human beings are dealing with, and that's the human immunodeficiency virus. We talked about that as being a human problem, and we talked about the importance of using an evolutionary biology perspective to understand the problem and also to come up with potential solutions. And in doing that, we actually talked about and got a little bit of an idea of some of the concepts that we're going to go back and deal with over the next several weeks. So if you really got some of that stuff, that will really help you. You're well on your way to getting the things we want to get out of here. So we learned some things about mutation and variation in populations of things, in this case viruses, but we also talked about some of those things in real organisms like people. We talked about competition, particularly among viruses within a host and across hosts. We've talked a little bit about natural selection. We've also spent some time doing population level thinking and tree thinking, thinking in bushes, not in lines of descent. We've talked a little bit about phylogenies, these trees that we're talking about and what they are and how they are useful. We did talk about the application of evolutionary principles to real world problems and how such a perspective is invaluable and in some cases completely necessary to understand or solve these problems. We also learned that natural selection does not have a goal. It doesn't lead to perfection. It leads to things that are sufficient at dealing with a particular place at a particular time and a particular set of rules for a game, if you want to have it that way. And we've also saw that evolution is not unidirectional. It's not going in one direction. It can go backwards and forwards if you want to use those words, but they're relative to where you are in a certain place and time. And then we saw this as a good example of the two things that happens, or two ways in which evolution manifests itself, and that is by transformation and diversification of these things that we call lineages. Okay? So, the other thing is when we were talking about diversification and transformation of lineages, so lineages changed and they went through time, and we actually generated, we saw, we saw things come into being that we didn't have before. So we saw the coming into being of HIV that didn't exist before from something SIV. So when we're talking about the transformation and diversification of lineages and this evolutionary process, we were also talking about the origins of things, where things come from. So we looked at a little bit of where this particular thing, HIV, comes from. And so that has broader applications, not just to the origin of different kinds of viruses, but the origins of other kinds of living things. And so now we have explanations for the origins of things. Is that something that human beings are interested in? Like that. Yeah, human beings. How long have people been interested in the origins of things? Be they physical things like this planet that we're on, or the origins of living things different than human beings and living things including human beings. Have they been interested in that for a long time? How long? Hundreds of years? Or thousands of years? What? Yeah. What? Somebody said something over here. Yeah, so that's when we're talking about. He's talking about there's people in Greece still, and we call them Greeks. But there was a heyday in Greek culture when the philosophers were very prominent. How long ago was that? Well, that's like 2,500 years ago. That's centuries BC. Okay, so is that when people started getting interested about their origins? No. Ever since human beings and the predecessors of our species that weren't even Homo sapiens, those first ones that had the capacity to formulate those kinds of ideas, they thought about those kinds of things and they pondered them. Okay, did they come up with explanations for those questions? Sure they did. Probably really fast. Okay, so so what time scale are we talking about here? Are we talking, it's not just hundreds of years, not just thousands of years, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands? Hundreds of thousands. So there have been things that if we caught one and shot it, because it probably doesn't want to be shot, and and a skateboard or a wooden leg falling off. If we caught one of these creatures, we could go back 200,000 years and capture one of these creatures, and we lay it on a table, and we would call it Homo sapiens. So our species, anatomically modern humans, have been around for a couple 100,000 years. But even before that, our predecessor species, some of them would have had the capacities to think of these things. And so people have thought of these questions and come up with answers to these questions for a long time. So when we're talking about the stuff that we used, the concepts and the ideas and the understanding that we used to understand that HIV problem, those are answers to some of these questions that are only on the order of 200, 250 years. Okay, so not very long. But I find it very helpful to understand those and understand the development of those ideas, where they came from. It's really helpful to go back and see where those other ideas came from and how they helped give rise to newer ideas, but also how older ideas got in the way of the development of some of these newer ideas. And so I want to go back far enough back in recorded and semi-recorded history to some of those early ideas. Okay, so peoples throughout history have always thought of these kinds of things, and they've come up with answers to some of these things. And lots of these are recorded in the creation myths that are present and possessed by virtually all cultures and all peoples throughout the world. Some of these things have been passed down orally for a long time, and some of them have been written down, and they're very interesting and they're very insightful. Okay? Let's read a couple of them. Now, although these stories have virtually nothing to do with reality, they are in and of themselves very interesting, and they say something about the cultures and the peoples that came up with them. Okay, if you look at hundreds to thousands of them across peoples, you see common themes, and you also see big differences that come out of different cultures and different environments and different times. I'm going to read you two little parts of two of them, and because I think they are neat, and again, they're very insightful. The first one comes from this book, which is The Dawn of Life and the Glories of Gods and Kings. It's called the Popol Vuh. Anybody know what culture this comes from? There's people sitting in this room right now that have ancestors where this came from. This is from the Maya, M-A-Y-A. Anybody in here with Mayan ancestors that you know? I bet you do. Maybe you don't know it, but there's people in here. What part of the world are we talking about? Yeah, Central America. We're talking southern Mexico, a place like Guatemala, and that part. Okay, it was farther north for the Aztecs, and more southern Central America were the Maya. And they had a very big, very sophisticated, and very broad understanding of where they came from. Let me read you a little bit from this book. It says, "Here follow the first words, the first eloquence." And when they're talking about first, they're talking about first, the first of anything ever being. And they set the stage here. There is not yet one person, one animal, bird, fish, crab, tree, rock, hollow, canyon, meadow, forest, a fancy way of saying there isn't anything yet, okay? But there is stuff. Things come from other places. Only the sky alone is there. The face of the earth is not clear. Only the sea alone is pooled under all the sky. There is nothing whatever gathered together. It is at rest. Not a single thing stirs. It is held back, kept at rest under the sky. Whatever there is that might be is simply not there. Only the pooled water, only the calm sea, only it alone is pooled. That's a common thing you see through lots and lots of cultures. Stuff comes from something, and it comes from water. There's water first. And what people have thought about the oceans and the seas for a long time, they think of it as being very primordial and being very long existent. And stuff can come from it. Okay, so this place actually started out with water. Whatever might be is simply not there. Only murmurs, ripples in the dark, in the night. Only the maker, modeler alone, the sovereign plumed serpent. The bearers, begetters, are in the water, a glittering light. They are there. They are enclosed in quetzal feathers in blue-green. Has anybody in here ever seen a quetzal? It's a bird. If you look at them, you have seen one? In what country? Guatemala. I saw a quetzal in Guatemala also. That is the most beautiful bird in the Western Hemisphere, okay? If you go to the old world, there are things called birds of paradise, and some of the pheasants and the peacock, that's where they're from. I gotta concede to those. Those are fancier than the quetzal, but that's a pretty fancy bird. And if you don't like hiking around in the hills looking for them, just get some money in Guatemala, and it's on the money, because it's an important bird there. And this was important to these people. So there was water, and there was sky, and then there were these kind of supernatural beings there. And then it says, and then the earth arose because of them. It was simply their word that brought it forth. So it's like things came about from a word, or a word is like an idea. It came about from their thinking. For the forming of the earth, they said, earth. It arose suddenly, just like a cloud, like a mist, now forming, unfolding. Then the mountains were separated from the water. All at once the great mountains came forth. By their genius alone, by their cutting edge alone, they carried out the conception of the mountain plain, whose face grew instant groves of cypress and pine. So, here were some things that really existed, and I guess if we pressed these people, they would say that they always existed, but it was from their mind, from their thinking, from their word, that the world came into being. Here's another one, and this is from the Marshall Islands. Anybody know where the Marshall Islands are? I'll bet a lot of money that somebody in here has Mayan ancestors, and I would bet a lot of money that nobody in here has ancestors from the Marshall Islands. It's just not as likely. Possible, but not as likely. It's a string of islands in the way out in the Pacific, kind of out far away from anything. So this is from those people there. It says, in the beginning, long ago, there was only if you live on an island, yeah, there was only the ocean. It was always there, okay? Then the god Loa came down, from where, they don't say, and he commanded, he caused a humming sound, and the Marshall Islands were made. He went back to heaven, and 4 men came to the island, this particular island called Ailinglap-Lap. They went in different ways, west, east, south, and north. The man in the east brought light, he was the sun. The one in the west had to see that all living things were made, he was life. The man from the south looked after the winds, he was wind. And the man in the north called all things by single acts, he was death. I always have to have that guy. Spoils all the fun. When sun, light, wind, and death found their different directions, god Loa sent a 5th man down to arrange the Marshall Islands. The 5th man put the islands in a basket and began placing them one by one in their proper order in the ocean. As the man went from Ailinglap-Lap to Jaluit, one island, Namarit, fell. He kind of probably tripped and dropped him by accident. And so that explains, lot of these old stories, they explain things in reality. So if you look at the Marshall Islands, they're all kind of in a row, but one of them's out of order. It's off to the side. So why is that? They knew that. Well, here's why. Because the guy in charge of putting them dropped one of them before he could put it where it belonged. Okay? He slipped out of his hand and he never bothered to put Namarick back in the right order. To this day, it is still out of line. Well, the man put Jalowit in the water and Evan next, then he threw away the basket. And the basket became the island Kili. That finished the making of the Marshall Islands. Then God sent down 2 men to a Linglap to tattoo all that it had been created. That's another old element too. After you get the land and you get organisms, and once you get people, a lot of times they get a job, and the job of the people is to put names on the organisms, okay? And that gives them, when you name something or you know the name of something, it's almost like you own it. You know something about it. It becomes almost a possessive thing. And so he put these men on this island to tattoo all that it created. The birds and animals, fishes, humans, everything. Everybody on earth had to come to a Linglap to be tattooed. So that's how each kind of thing has its own markings. And that's why the highest ranked tattoos are for chiefs, and different ones are for women, and then commoners and animals. That's good that the women are at least better than commoners and animals. So, again, those stories are very insightful. They are explanations they're solutions to a problem. People know they're there, they know stuff about their surroundings, but they don't have any explanations for why it is that way. But we are human beings, we have to have explanations for things. We have to know answers to things, and so they came up with them. And again, they don't have anything to do really with reality, these stories, but they do tell us about the cultures that they came from, and they're very insightful. And as we'll see, one of our themes of today and Wednesday is older ideas shape the way people think today. And it's very hard to change the way that you think. And old ideas can stick around for a very long time. Now these things, the kinds of explanations that people, prehistoric people came up with, we would call these based on supernatural forces, things that you can't measure, you can't demonstrate, you can't observe. And it was a long time before human beings came up with non-supernatural explanations for things. Now, our modern understanding of the origins of things and why they are the way they are, these are scientific kinds of explanations, which are different from those that I just read you. And those things come primarily out of Europe, which comes from Western thinking. Now, we could follow the development of evolutionary ideas starting in any place on the globe, but we're really going to focus on Europe now, because that's where science comes from, and that's where our modern understanding of these concepts come from. So we're going to focus on Europe, because that's where these ideas come from. So really the first people that come up with non-supernatural, or that is mechanistic explanations for the origins of things and where they came from is who? You have the answer. No, you have the answer.
Greeks?
Yes, yeah, it comes from the Greek philosophers. And these people were hundreds of years BC, okay? So the important thing here is these are the first mechanistic explanations, non-supernatural explanations for why things are the way that they are. So they're using not supernatural but natural explanations for the way things are, and they're very different from what I was reading you before. So we have these people in Greece, and even by this time, so let's say this is just a rough time period here. even by this time, people were moving around. And you didn't have to go far from Greece, and you can get over to places like Egypt, and you can get over to places like Mesopotamia. And so these thinkers in Greece are also getting exposed to things like geometry from Egypt and astronomy from Mesopotamia. And so their world is becoming bigger, and they're starting to experience other ideas from other cultures, and these are other ideas from other cultures of those people solving problems and using them as tools. So it's not surprising that they would also incorporate some of this kind of thinking into their thinking. So they come up with mechanistic kinds of explanations, and some of these are really outlandish. There's one by this guy named Empedocles, and he says that at first only body parts originated, heads or limbs without bodies, heads without eyes or mouths, and so on. While floating, I don't know where they're floating, it's not clear about that, these parts were attracted to each other until perfect combinations were achieved. Imperfect ones perished, but the more perfect ones continue to exist. That's a mechanistic, natural explanation, right? It doesn't involve any supernatural processes. It's not very good. It's not the way it works. But the important thing is people are coming up with other kinds of ideas. Here's another one from a guy named Anaximander. The first animals were generated in the moisture and were enclosed within spiny barks. As they grew older, they migrated onto the drier land, and once their outer bark was split and shed, they survived for a short time in the new mode of existence. This is kind of like what if you observe the larvae of insects that exhibit complete metamorphosis. They have a larva and then it pupates, and it's within kind of a case, and after some time it breaks out of that case and something different comes out. So again, these ideas are really wrong, but they don't come from nowhere. They come from somewhere, and these people were somewhat familiar with some natural processes, and so they're incorporating it into their understandings of origins. Man was different, though, here. It says, man to begin with was generated from living things of another kind. Since, whereas others can quickly hunt for their own food, men alone require prolonged nursing. If he had been like that in the beginning, he never would have survived. Thus, men were formed within these fish-like creatures and remained within them like embryos until they had reached maturity. Then at last the creatures burst open, and out of them came men and women who were able to fend for themselves. Again, totally wrong, and yet these are mechanistic, natural explanations for the way things in the world worked. Also at this time, and we talked about this a little bit a week or so ago, remember how people solve problems? They thought about things. They used logic and reasoning, and it must be that way because it makes the most sense in my mind to do that. Okay? That's very different from science, which is based on what? Experimentation and observation of things. Some people kind of did a little bit of that when we start getting into the 300s BC. There was people like Hippocrates. You ever heard of that guy? Yeah, so this really has a little bit to do with medicine. I think those of you that become doctors, don't you have to take the Hippocratic oath or something? They still do that? It says stuff about taking care of other people, and I don't know. Is it anything like that? Yeah, I guess. And this person, or this school of thinking, they actually did place a little more stock in observing things and measuring things and doing some kind of more like of an empirical approach. And they had some other ideas that maybe the kinds of organisms or that the condition of organisms is somehow influenced by their environment. You know, that's some possibility. About the same time, we get to another one of the philosophers, Socrates, and people are starting to think about problems and explanations for things, things in the world. So we've got people solving problems by logic and reasoning, and a little bit of solving problems by empirical observation, kinds of things like that. Then we get to really a student like of Socrates, a guy named Plato, and he lived from 427 to 347 BC. And so here Greek philosophy starts to move toward a little bit toward more metaphysics and trying to deal with explanations of the ultimate nature of existence, the ultimate nature of objects and things and living things and the cosmos. The thinking of that time also is being greatly influenced by mathematics. Okay, math isn't science, it's something else, and people are starting to realize this universal language of mathematics and how to use it as a tool and how to understand it, but also what it says about the organization of the universe, particularly geometry is something that they're becoming more skilled at and being very useful. But at this time they have very little understanding of biology. In fact, their understandings of biology and their ideas turn out to be disasters for later understandings of biology. There are some really bad ideas that people can't get rid of for a long time, and it really slows down progress in things like biology, and particularly evolutionary thinking, which is the focus of our class. One of these is this idea of essentialism. And that is that things exist in two realms. They exist in the realm of reality, of things that you can touch, but they also exist in a transcendent world of ideas, or the ID, E-I-D-E, okay? And real objects that you can touch and feel and see around you, those things are all physical manifestations of this transcendent, perfect ideal of each of those things. So we could think of this pen. And these pens here, they're not all the same. They're a little different. Some are more imperfect than others. But these are all physical manifestations of this transcendent ideal pen that exists only in the realm of ideas, and it's not something that you can touch or feel. These IDs, or these essences of things, have always existed. So when we're talking about the Greek philosophers, they have no real notion of time, and so these essences of things have always been in existence, and they've always been that way. Okay? Well, if something has always been that way, and it's always going to be that way, what's one thing you can't have? Say it loud. One of you guys whispered it. I don't even remember. If these things are physical manifestations of a transcendent ideal, and it comes from the world of these essences that have always been that way, and they always will be that way, that notion is completely antithetical to the notion of what? Yeah, which is another way is saying what? Change. Yeah. You would never even start to contemplate any notion of explaining change because change doesn't happen. Okay? In the world of essences and ideas, these things are perfect. They don't change. They have always been that way. You would never even entertain the thought of trying to explain change because it doesn't exist. It's not anything you would ever think of. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, in reality, it doesn't make sense because that's not how the world works. But I'm telling you, this is what people thought in that time. So there's this idea of essentialism. And we will see that sticks in people's head, not for just tens of years, but hundreds of years. And we will encounter people, evolutionary biologists, in the 1700s and in the 1800s, and they are also essentialists. Which brings us to one of the things we've got to keep in mind today and on Wednesday. This is one of these old ideas that people won't get rid of. And so we take and we advance and learn something new, but we don't progress very far with it because we carry with us this other baggage of ideas that's very hard to get rid of. If we were much better at getting rid of poor ideas once we knew they weren't right and moving on with new ideas that we know are right, we would have figured out some of these things much faster. But that's not how we work. We'll see that people's understanding and the people that solve problems, it's very much influenced by the cultural and social environment that you grow up in. You're a product of your times, you're a product of your education, and all of those things influence you. Yeah, people stand on the shoulders of somebody that learned something before them, and that's progressive, but you carry with you a lot of baggage, and people don't drop that baggage very fast. So, the Greek philosophers have this idea of essentialism, and it's tough to get rid of that. They also have this concept of an animate, like being alive, cosmos. When I say cosmos, that's kind of a way of saying everything, okay? All the stars, all the other planets, all the other galaxies, all of our universe. But it's animate, and it's harmonious. Everything's working perfectly, everything works just right, okay? So it's this like somewhat living, harmonious whole thing, and that also makes it difficult to come up with this notion of change, because you can't change something that's perfect without making it less perfect, okay? So again, these things go back thousands of years, but this is what people thought at the time, and we'll see that these are often blockades to coming up with notions of evolution. They also have this notion that kind of along this, that there's order and purpose in nature. Okay, it looks like it works well. And then along this line, we can also say that the world is thus static and eternal. So they don't have any notion of real time. It's always been this way, and it's always going to be that way. And Plato has a student, and who's that? Aristotle. Okay, so a little bit after Plato's time. So a lot of the stuff from Plato's time, this is really a disaster for understanding the real world. But there's some progress made with Aristotle, because he looks at the world in a little bit different way, and he does more observing and collecting of things, and trying to understand the world with a little bit more of an empirical approach. Again, he's later. He's from 384 to 322 BC, and he's really the first great naturalist. That is somebody that studies natural history. They study the world. Around them. And he saw kind of a gradation in nature, that things kind of not so much lumpy in these essences, but there was kind of somewhat of a more smoother gradation of one kind of thing into other things. One of the things this led into, actually much later, was something called the Great Chain of Being. It's also known as the Scala Naturae, or the natural scale, the natural way that this is a description from this time of how things are organized. And they're organized from simple things to more complicated things. So we would have down here at the bottom inanimate objects. So maybe an example might be rocks. And then we would have, let's see, maybe something like plants. and then maybe about something we might call simple animals, complex animals, humans, angels, and God or gods up here. Now this is not to represent some system by which things come into being. This is a representative of how these people thought things were organized. Okay, remember these things are physical manifestations of representing ideals, things from the transcendent world of ideas that don't change. But this is how those things are organized. Okay, and they're organized in the important thing here, they're organized in a linear fashion. Remember what I said we learned about population thinking, and we also learned how to think what? Think bushes, think trees. Bushes with branches, remember diversification? That is very different than that. And yet this influences people's thinking for a very long time. That's not how life is organized in the world. We'll see later on people start realizing that because they look at the world and they look at this and they say, well, it really can't be like this because the world that I see is not organized that way. So perhaps that is not the right way to think. And yet it still pervades our thinking today. Okay, we tend to think of things as being like a ladder rather than a bush or a tree. And so that's why we keep pounding this into our heads here. But again, still the world is eternal. The world is unchanging. Everything has a purpose. There's order in nature. If we had Aristotle in here, he would be opposed to evolution of any kind. He wouldn't get it. It would make no sense because things don't change. The things we see today are based upon unchanging essences. Again, they had this really poor concept of what time is, because things can be eternal and things can always be this way. That comes from essentialism. The other thing about Aristotle, though, is I said here, he's really the first person that really does any kind of organized natural history. And we'll see that actually he's helping to lay the foundations of our evolutionary thinking and solving these problems, because the only way we can understand evolution is to infer it from things that happened in the past, and that studying those things is what? Natural history. So it comes from doing natural history that Aristotle started that we are able to really solve these problems. So he lays the framework for something and is the founder of kind of one way of doing things, and yet it leads to something that he doesn't, when he was alive, would never have understood it. It would never have made any sense to him. So he's not an evolutionary biologist, and yet he starts doing something that our real understanding of evolutionary biology is based upon. Okay? Then we have to go, a great deal of time has to pass before any big changes take place in the way people think about how the world works. And again, we're looking in Europe. And then what happens in the 12th century? Well, before that, there was the big power in Europe and parts of Asia were what? So after the Greeks, who really kind of took over everything? Roman, yeah. So the Roman Empire. I mean, they really ruled everything. Huge pieces of land, and they ruled what people did and kind of how people thought. And if you went against the Roman Empire, you usually didn't live long, or you ended up in prison or things like that. And it wasn't until the fall of the Roman Empire that a new overarching way of thinking starts to pervade through Europe. And so that's what? That's Christianity. Okay, that really starts to spread throughout these parts of the world that were previously held in an iron grip by the Roman Empire, and that influences how people think. And Christianity at that time thought not like this, but in a different way, okay? So understanding how the world works from that perspective, where does your information come from? It comes from scriptures and things that people had written many hundreds to a couple of thousand years before that, either orally passed down or finally writing down to paper. And it's not essentialism, okay? It's not an eternal existence. It's actually something that happened not that long ago. And these things that we're trying to understand their origins actually took place not that long ago, but on the order of thousands of years before. And they were created really from nothing into something. And yet, once they were that way, they don't change. So that's kind of the same here, static, but fairly recently derived and fairly recently created things. So again, this is a new ideology, a new way of thinking, and it spreads throughout this area. People start thinking about the world in a different place. Also, I said, you know, if you think outside the box, the Roman Empire, they were pretty tough on you. Well, the same thing happens here. You can't think outside the box, or at least you can't do that and tell everybody about it. Okay? Remember we were talking about people like Galileo and free thinkers, and even ideas that are based on observation, and they're so obvious that that's the way the world works. If that wasn't within the mindset of the Roman Catholic Church, particularly the big powerful Roman Catholic Church, that was heresy, and you could be put to death or certainly imprisoned and tortured and made to change your ideas. Okay, and so that's what happened to people like Galileo. Let's see. The church actually apologized for putting Galileo in prison. It took him a while. In 1992, they said, well, you know, he really was right. We're kind of sorry for what we did to him, and he didn't get to hear it. But that's kind of like what we're talking about in, say, evolutionary biology. There are institutions in the world that they get there, but man, are they slow. And part of the reason is they don't want to make mistakes. And so they take hundreds of years sometimes to figure out something, so you don't do it wrong. You got to give them credit there, but God, it would have been nicer if it happened a little bit faster. So we have this very literal interpretation of some old writings that say that the universe and the earth and life was created from nothing only thousands of years ago in a short amount of time. Now, there were also some other more liberal interpretations of the same thing, but that's really not the prevailing idea of the organized church at the time. Some other ideas that competed about the same time, there was an idea called nominalism, and that's different than essentialism. It's that there are the objects in the world, yes, they're variable, but they can be categorized by names. Like nominal means like a name, by using the word pen. They're not these eternal essences, but there are names for groups of things, and we call these pens. And it's almost like, a little bit like population thinking. We have lots of individuals that vary, but they're all pens. And they're united in that way by that word. And that's kind of what nominalism is. It's different than what we're just talking about, and it's different than this. So I don't want to give you the idea that everybody only thought one way, but that's the prevailing way of thinking. And then we have the Reformation in the 16th century, and things get even tougher. Literal interpretations really get more of a billing, and there's really a squelching of free thinking by people. And so the environment is not available for people to solve some of these problems. But this is also a time when there's kind of, by many learned people, a kind of rediscovery of the ancients, a rediscovery of Greek thinking, and a rediscovery of Roman thinking. And again, people are moving around, and they're encountering peoples from different places and different things. And people are rereading some of the Greek classics and encountering different ways of thinking that don't jive with the way that they're really supposed to be thinking. And we have a bit of a scientific revolution starting to take place. So we mentioned people like Galileo and Copernicus and people like Isaac Newton. And so one of the things that Newton does is he can explain things in nature, physical things. He's not concerned with biological things so much, but he can explain parts of the physical nature of the world using numbers and using math and coming up with relationships and formulas that explain things in nature. Those are different kinds of explanations. There seems to be some organization to it, and you can explain these things using very mechanistic processes and things like mathematics that are unchanging. 4 and 4 always equals 6. 8. Yeah. And so this is a different way that people are using to explain things. And really soon after that, it's like, hey, if Newton could explain the physical nature of the world using mechanistic laws, I wonder if we can do that with biology. Why not? Okay, so people start to branch out and think about biological phenomena in a different way. Other breaks from the thinking of the church take place in literature. People can write things that are fiction stories. So that everybody knows they're not true, they're fiction, but they start to explore other kinds of ideas within fiction writing. And some of these involve origins of the universe, origins of the earth, and some of these actually involve organisms changing. In fact, organisms changing so much that they change into other things. So some of these ideas start to pervade literature that people can read and think about them themselves. The idea, though, that the universe evolved or changed actually comes pretty late. You can trace a fairly well-organized description of this back to the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And he wrote something called A General History of Nature and a Theory of the Heavens in 1755. And in it, he describes the universe as being something that is not always that way. It changes and can become something else. Okay? And so again, these are little steps in one direction of understanding the world in a different way. And by now, literature and writing it's much easier to spread it around. Why? What happened in the 1500s? What did Gutenberg figure out? Yeah, okay, it used to be people would sit there and have to write stuff with pens, but now you can print it, and that's dangerous. That's dangerous to the powers that be because now other people can read things and figure out for themselves. Yeah.
What was the name of the book?
History of Nature and a Theory of the Heavens. I never read that. Be interesting. Okay, so we start breaking some of these barriers and moving out of our old way of thinking through literature. Then we get a way of looking at the world that is a little bit along those lines, but also a little bit different. And here we're talking about a guy named Gottfried Leibniz. This is one smart dude. What is one of the things that Newton discovered? Well, to figure out his problems about physics and stuff like that, he had to invent a whole nother branch of mathematics. Yeah, that was my bane in college. Yeah, I took my calculus classes over and over and over again, not because I liked it, but for other reasons. But Newton developed that as a tool to solve problems. Totally amazing. This guy also discovered, if you want to call it discovering, that something that we call calculus. His is a little bit different, but the same thing. Not, fairly close in time. So this is a smart guy. One of the ideas that he was a proponent of, it's something called the principle of plentitude. And this is the idea held, again, a lot of when I write some idea with somebody that usually is not, they're not the ones that came up with this, but it was some idea of the day, and they often were a big proponent of it, or they were a big publicizer of it, or they really developed it, so sometimes it gets associated with them, and that's the case here. So the principle of plenitude is that all the things that we see in the world, again, were made by God, and anything that God could actually conceive as being possible must exist. You can't leave anything out. So all the creatures and everything in the universe are things that were from the mind of God, and so they're all in existence. And anything that's not here, it's not here because it wasn't thought of by God, and everything that could be thought of is there. Okay? Can you take any of those pieces away? No. You'll wreck it, right? Because it's good, it's perfect, and you can't take stuff away. So if you can't take stuff away, organisms, we already talked about taking organisms away. If we take a whole species away, that's called what? Yeah, so you get these people that we're talking about now, you get them in this room and you ask them about extinction and they would look at you like, what are you talking about? That's not something that we even talk about. Not because it's bothersome, it can't be. You can't have something that's perfect and take pieces of it away, because what does it become then? It becomes imperfect, yeah, so you can't take things away. So there are notions of thought and ideas that we can't even think of or contemplate because they can't be that way, given things like this and the ways that we think. So none of these organisms could ever go extinct. Also, the principle of plenitude was also a little bit associated with this, because if you look at this in another way, you can also think of some kind of progress in not just the organization of things, but progress in how things came into existence. And so he might have also been somewhat an essentialist, but he also thought that maybe things, they have multiple essences within them, and you could realize different essences over time, and so plants could realize different essences in the sense that they might be something that we would now call them an animal. Okay? So there is a little bit of a notion of change here, but things really aren't going outside the box too much, and they're only realizing or revealing hidden potentials that are represented by these essentialist types. This also gave rise to something that we call natural theology. It's different than revealed theology, is that you can learn about God from God, but also from other people who get it through scriptures. That's what's called revealed theology. Natural theology is you learn about the characteristics of God by studying what? Nature. Okay, so you study the real world, and since it came from God, if you study the things that came from God, then you can learn something about God. That's what natural theology is about. And this stuff here really gives rise to this thing that we call natural theology. So we're dealing with, let me put the time periods up here. Let's say very early 1700s. Okay?
What was the definition of the principle again?
The principle of plenitude, we could think that it's God is perfect, and so anything that God could think of as possibly existing must exist. And that's where things came from. It's also a little bit like this idea of essentialism. These ideas, these transcendent ideals, these ideas, here they just exist. Here those things exist in the mind of God. That's where the essences come from. Okay? And that's really where they are. okay? And so anything that could be is, and because of that, you can't take anything away, and that's what things are. They're related to those, and also things are perfect, okay, because it's all there, it works good, it's perfect, and so that completely abolishes the idea of change, because if something is perfect, any change makes it less perfect, and we can't have that. All right? Okay. What else happens or starts to happen in the very early 1700s? Remember, there's lots of different people, and lots of people are doing different things. In the 1700s, we also start getting people that are doing science and the precursors of science in lots of different fields. So some of these fields are, let's go early 1700s. We start to get things like geology. People are going out, they're looking at the physical aspects of the world, they're looking at rocks, and they're looking at different kinds of rocks. Particularly one kind is very revealing. What are those three, from your geology, what are those three main kinds of rocks? Limestone. I gotta stop asking you guys questions, because all you have to give me is whatever I ask. Yeah, there's igneous rocks, which are what? So that's molten rock that cools and becomes a rock. And then there's metamorphic rock that was something else and it's kind of changed by pressure and heat. And then what's the other kind? Sedimentary rock. Okay, where do they come from? Well, they come from other kinds of rocks, sedimentary rocks, metamorphic rocks, igneous rocks that are weathered by water and wind, and they're moved, sometimes by wind, but mostly by water. Streams and rivers. Streams and rivers do two things. They move water, and they move it which way? Downhill, okay? That's why I always wondered, you know when they have these river rafting, you have to have a guide to go river rafting? I never got that. You always go downstream. What do you need the guide for, right? Does he ever have a guide that says, let's go upstream? No. You stay in the river and go downstream. What do we need you for? But rivers do two things. What? Okay. Rivers do two things. They move water downstream and they move sediments downstream. The faster the water moves, the more sediment they can pick up and entrain, and when water slows down, sediments settle out. Particularly in estuaries or where rivers dump into the ocean or streams dump into lakes and ponds, the sediment comes out and it's laid down in layers. Another word for these layers, particularly after this exists for a long time and becomes lithified and turned into stone. These are sedimentary strata. Okay? And the older ones are down here and the newer ones are here. You can see this take place. You can go, anybody that's been around here and there's a flood takes place, this is what happens in your living room. Carries in mud and sediments and dumps it there. People started looking at these, and one of the things they did was they figured out, well, I wonder how long it takes to go from here to here, and some of these you can measure because you can see it happen. And then they look at the big picture and they say, well, if this took 50 years, and then you start looking this way, what's one of the things that you realize? Ooh, that takes a long time to make, maybe hundreds of feet of sedimentary strata and rocks. And so you got one group of people telling you that the world is a few thousand years old, and then if you start doing this, it like comes out way older than that. And this is something that you can see and you can measure. So one of the things people are beginning to realize by going out and looking at the real world is it's kind of different than what other people have been telling us. But it really has to be this way because I can see that. Okay? So what we're working on is we're working again on these slowly changing ideas. We got a long ways to go, but we're seeing where these breakthroughs are taking place. Another thing, if you start looking at sedimentary rocks, and you start looking at them close, it's not just sand, it's not just dirt and sediment. There are other things that get washed down streams and end up deposited in sedimentary strata, and those are what? Yeah, well, dead organisms. That's what happens. To throw a dead cat in a creek, watch it, it'll go down the stream, it'll get hung up on something, or it'll end up, and it'll get buried by sediments. And so people start looking at these things that are in these strata of rocks, and these are fossils. These are the indications of the remains of organisms. And one of the things that they realize is not just are strata organized from older to younger, and the strata down here are different than the strata up here, but the kinds of things that you see in here as far as fossils go, the things down here are different than the things up here, and the things down here are older than the things up here. And another thing about the stuff that you find in here, oftentimes they are things, in some cases they're very similar to things that we know of that are alive. In other cases they're kind of like stuff that's alive today, and yet different. And in some cases they are very different than anything that's alive today. So if you find something down here that's really different from something that you see today, what is a possible explanation of that? Well, it could be still living on Earth and we just haven't found it. That's a good explanation, that's a good alternative, it's a very good possibility. What's another explanation? Well, it's representative of something that's not here anymore, okay? It's extinct. Well, we're not ready to go there yet, but it looks like there were things on the Earth before that aren't here today. We don't have a lot of information to go on this, but it's a good possibility. So we're not there yet here in the 1700s. Also, if you go to different places in the globe, you see similarities and you see differences. And people are doing good old-fashioned natural history. They're studying groups of organisms, particularly birds, flowering plants, insects, kind of the three big groups, but also, of course, all kinds of other groups of organisms. But these are three big ones that people are spending a lot of time looking at and trying to understand them, looking at their relationships, maybe why they are the way they are. And as people are going around the globe, they see that there are kinds of organisms here, but when you go to another place, they have different kinds of organisms in different places. So there are actually patterns across the globe that are exhibited in the kinds of things, both animal and plant, that are living in these places. Not just living in a place now, but also living in different places throughout time. Okay, and so people are starting to get a handle on distributions of organisms. Also, plain old general biology, particularly the invention of one of the greatest, the coolest things in the world that was invented, I think, around late 1600s. And you can see really small stuff with it. What's that? It's a microscope. Yeah. If you don't have much money and you want to take a trip somewhere, you want to go to another world and you don't have enough money to go to Madagascar, just get a microscope and look at stuff under a microscope. And it is virtually looking at another world. And people started doing that in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And one of the things that they realized is, oh, this world is not just complicated, it's extremely complicated. It's extremely diverse. In fact, there's a whole other world of creatures out there, bacteria and protozoans. We didn't even know they existed. We didn't know they existed. You can't see them with your eyes, and yet they're there. And I can imagine being the first person looking at some of that stuff and realizing these are organisms, and there's tons of them. okay? It's a whole nother world. And some of our old explanations aren't really footing the bill. And one of them is that when we start to get a handle on organisms in the world, these kinds of explanations for their organization, they don't seem to work very well. There's a lot of continuity among things like this, and this is very linear, with these things being higher or more complicated than this, but organisms in real life aren't organized that way. Okay, there are things that you might think of being down here that are in some ways more complicated than things that we might find up here, and perhaps life isn't organized this way, but it's organized kind of this way. Okay? Another thing that comes out of this is biogeography and geography. And here we're looking at patterns in the distributions of organisms, plants and animals, across the globe. And there are patterns being revealed by these organism distributions that are very insightful. Like I said, you can go to certain places in the world and you can predict the kinds of things that you will see there, and you can go to other parts of the world and predict the kinds of things that you can see there, but they're very different kinds of things. And we can see things that live geographically very close to other places that we know, and yet the organisms are quite different. And we can look at some places that are very far apart, and yet they have very similar kinds of biologies, particularly as we'll see in a week or so, we start looking at weird places like islands. Again, if you want to see weird, neat stuff in biology, go to islands. We'll see why that is later, but people start realizing that. Why are islands such strange places and have such strange things on them that are different than the things in a different way than the things we see on the mainland? And we'll see one of the big sources of data for understanding evolutionary biology becomes biogeography. And then human beings are dealing with this wide variety of organisms, and so these things require names. We said how important that was, and so we get things like the field of systematics and taxonomy, where people are putting names on organisms and classifying them. And when I'm talking about classifying, you're putting names on these objects, these things in the world, but then they need to be organized in some way. Okay? What kind of system can we use to organize them? And so people start putting individual things, names that we put on species, they start putting them in groups, because some of them look similar, and these ones look similar to each other more than they look to something else, and so we put those something else's in other groups. And we'll see there are some very insightful people that looked at those patterns and realized something about how the world is organized. They didn't get the answer, but they pointed it out, and other people solved the problem. So this is also an important field of endeavor, scientific endeavor, that is going to lead to some very big breakthroughs in our understanding of the world. Again, the people that are doing all of these things live in a place, and they live in a time, and what they can do is really influenced by the sociology of their culture, their educational background, some of their monetary background, what they have available to them. But they're very influenced by what the rest of the world thinks. And they may learn new things, but it's very hard for them to break out of these old fields of understanding, even though they're learning new things. And this is a theme that's going to run through what we have been talking about and what we're going to talk about. Okay, I'm going to run through a few people. Again, what's going to happen here, we're going to talk about some people from a certain time and a certain place, and they grew up a certain way, and they learn new things, and they make some headway, and they stick with some old ideas, and it's hard for them to change. Let's see. Okay, the first guy we're going to talk about is this guy named Maupertuis. His name is Pierre-Louis Miraut de Maupertuis. He is from, let's say, early to mid 1700s. What country do you suppose he's from? With a fancy name like that, he's got to be from France, right? Yeah. Okay, so he is one of the most advanced thinkers of his time. He's in France. One of the things he does is he goes and he takes Newtonian thinking. Where was Newton? Where was he? He was in England. Okay, so he's taking Newtonian thinking and he's going to try to apply it to biology. Okay, can we understand biological processes using mathematics and build laws around biology? But he quickly realized that these relatively simple Newtonian laws are no match for biological diversity and biological complexity. It's not going to work that way. Also, there are emergent properties of biology that you can't explain based on reductionist ideas and chemical and physical laws. So these laws of force and motion, that kind of stuff, that level of complexity is not sufficient for understanding biological complexity. He's also very strongly opposed to deterministic and creationist kinds of Newtonianism. And he goes back to some of the old Greek ideas, he goes back to some of the old Roman ideas and philosophers, and he ascribes the origins of things, not to deterministic processes or outside forces, but largely to accident. Okay, they are this way just because that's the way that they are. There is nothing behind them making them be this way. They are that way. He also criticizes the tenets of natural theology. Okay, this is no way of learning about, say, God, and this is no way of learning about how the world works. He incorporates spontaneous generation into things like the Scala Naturae. Maybe these simple things come about by spontaneous generation, and then these simple things change into more complicated things. Okay? That's different than the old way of thinking. It's still wrong, but you can see it's a different way of thinking, and this change word is coming into people's thinking. Okay? They're seeing this stuff, and they're trying to explain it. Okay? But they know new things, and they're using little bits of old things and new things to try to explain what's going on. Let's finish him, and then we'll quit. So he has a more complex interpretation of the Scala Naturae. Perhaps things can move along the scale and work their way up. Also, he was, I erased it, this guy was an essentialist. Okay? Yeah, things may be able to change along the chain here, but they're really just switching essences. So in his view, something can switch from representing one essence to representing another essence. So there's kind of a temporal aspect to the scale. The big thing here, though, is that he is allowing and he is incorporating this notion of change into the understanding of not only how the world is organized, but how the world got to be the way that it is. Let's see. Let's stop there. We'll pick up with the next. We did pretty good today. Has anybody got any questions about stuff we did today before we leave? Okay? Think about